It was a warm summer morning when I first noticed the commotion outside my lake property. The calm waters sparkled in the sun, but the peace did not last for long. Karen, the self-proclaimed leader of the lake HOA, was pacing back and forth at the edge of my property. Her arms were crossed, and her lips were pursed tight, as if she had been waiting for this moment all along. She marched right up to my porch, and without even saying hello, she barked at me. "You need to pack your things and leave immediately. This property falls under HOA rules, and you are in violation." I looked at her in disbelief because I knew every inch of the paperwork and the history of my land. My grandfather had purchased this lake property decades ago, long before any HOA even existed. I calmly explained that my home was private property and not under the jurisdiction of her HOA. But Karen smirked and waved a stack of papers in my face, claiming she had the authority. She even threatened to call the police if I did not vacate the property by the end of the day. I simply told her to do what she felt was necessary, because I was not going anywhere. Within an hour, 2 police cars rolled down the dirt road and pulled up in front of my cabin. Karen rushed to greet them, dramatically pointing at me and yelling that I was trespassing on HOA land. The officers listened carefully, but before approaching me, they asked Karen a few direct questions about her claims. As she stumbled through her answers, it became obvious that her so-called paperwork was nothing more than printed HOA guidelines. The officers finally turned to me and asked to see my property deed. I walked inside, retrieved the official documents, and handed them over. The deed clearly showed my name and proved beyond a doubt that my lake property was privately owned. When the officers compared the deed to the county records on their system, they both nodded. Karen began to protest, raising her voice, insisting that HOA rules overruled everything. But one of the officers shook his head and explained firmly that HOA power only extended to members and properties within their jurisdiction. My cabin was not part of that jurisdiction, and Karen had no legal claim over my land. Her face turned bright red, and she tried to argue again, but the officers warned her that making false claims could lead to charges. The neighbors had gathered by now, whispering and watching the scene unfold. Some of them looked embarrassed, while others seemed secretly pleased that Karen had finally been challenged. I stood quietly on my porch as Karen stammered and tried to save face, but it was clear her power was slipping away. The officers told her to leave my property immediately and reminded her that if she returned to harass me again, she could be charged with trespassing. Karen froze for a moment, looking as though she could not believe what she was hearing. Karen clenched her fists, and for a moment, I thought she might refuse to move. The officers stood their ground, waiting for her to make a decision. Finally, with a sharp huff, she spun around and stormed off the porch, her heels crunching against the gravel. The neighbors who had gathered along the road whispered among themselves, watching as the woman who once bossed them around marched away in humiliation. I could see the frustration in her stride, the way her head jerked from side to side, as if she was looking for someone to support her. But not a single neighbor stepped forward to defend her. Instead, they slowly began drifting away, some shaking their heads, others giving me quiet nods of approval. I stayed on my porch until the crowd was gone, the air settling back into the calm rhythm of the lake. The officers returned my deed and told me that my property was protected by state law and no HOA could override that. One of them even mentioned that this was not the first time they had dealt with Karen making exaggerated claims. It seemed she had developed a reputation for using intimidation to get her way. After the police cars rolled off, I sat on the porch swing, looking out over the still waters of the lake. It felt strange that a place I had always associated with peace and family memories had turned into a battlefield for someone else's power games. But deep down, I knew this was not the end of it. Karen was the type who thrived on control, and she was not going to let go easily. The next morning, I caught sight of her again. This time, she was standing at the far corner of my property with a notebook in hand. She was scribbling something down, her eyes darting between my cabin, my dock, and the hedge line that separated the properties. I stepped outside, and she snapped her book shut quickly, as if she had been caught doing something she should not. Her face flushed, and she called out that she was just conducting an HOA inspection. I reminded her firmly that she had no authority here and warned her to stay off my land. Karen turned on her heel and walked away, but I could see that same look of determination burning in her eyes. It was clear she was plotting her next move, and I would need to be ready for whatever she had planned next. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the treeline, I noticed Karen once again lingering near the edge of my property. This time, she was not alone. A couple of HOA board members stood beside her holding clipboards and trying to look official. They pointed at my fence, my dock, and even the stone fire pit that my grandfather had built decades ago. I walked down toward them and asked what exactly they thought they were doing. Karen smirked and announced loudly that they were documenting violations of HOA standards. I reminded her once again that my property was not under her HOA jurisdiction. One of the board members shifted uncomfortably and whispered something to her, but she waved him off, refusing to back down. She told me she was preparing a report to present at the next HOA meeting where they would vote to fine me and order my removal. I almost laughed at the absurdity, but I could see she truly believed her own authority. Rather than argue, I pulled out my phone and began recording. I calmly asked her to explain on camera why she believed she had power over land that county records clearly showed was privately owned. Her face twitched as she realized she was being documented. The two board members glanced at each other nervously, and one of them muttered that maybe this was not a good idea. Karen snapped at him to be quiet, insisting that she knew what she was doing. But her voice trembled just enough for me to see the cracks forming in her confidence. I told them all politely to leave my property and warned that if they returned again, I would file a trespassing complaint. The board members quickly backed away, clearly not eager to get tangled in Karen's obsession. Karen lingered for a moment, her jaw tight, her knuckles white around her clipboard, before she finally turned and stormed off once again. As I watched her retreat, I knew this feud was far from over. The calm waters of the lake reflected the fading light, but in the shadows, Karen was already planning her next attempt to push me off the land that rightfully belonged to me. The following week, I noticed more subtle attempts from Karen to assert herself. She started slipping letters into my mailbox stamped with the HOA logo and full of supposed violations written in bold letters. Each letter demanded action from me, whether it was repainting my cabin, changing the style of my dock, or removing my fire pit. I ignored every one of them because I knew they had no legal weight. But Karen was not the type to accept being ignored. One morning, I woke to the sound of voices outside, and when I looked out my window, I saw Karen standing on my dock with two men in suits. They were surveying the property with measuring tapes, as if preparing for some grand case. I rushed outside, demanding to know why strangers were on my land. Karen held up a folder and said these were her lawyers, and she was preparing to file an injunction against me. The lawyers looked uneasy when I reminded them they were trespassing on private property, and I had already dealt with this through the police. They exchanged glances, clearly realizing they had been dragged into something questionable. One of them quietly advised Karen that proceeding without jurisdiction could backfire badly, but Karen brushed him off, insisting she was in the right. I pulled out my phone once again, recording the entire exchange. Karen glared at me, her voice rising as she claimed the HOA had ultimate authority over the entire lakeside. I calmly asked her to show any proof of that claim, and when she could not, her face turned red with frustration. The lawyers muttered excuses and quickly left, not wanting to be caught further in her antics. Karen stayed behind, fuming and pacing on my dock until I told her firmly she had 10 seconds to step off my property, or I would call the sheriff. She left, but not before pointing a finger at me and promising that this was not the end. That night, I sat on my porch listening to the sounds of the lake and thinking about how far Karen was willing to go. Her obsession was growing stronger, and it was clear she was not just fighting for control. She was fighting to protect her image of power over everyone around the lake. And I knew that sooner or later she would make a mistake big enough that even her own neighbors could not ignore anymore. A few days later, the air around the lake felt heavy with whispers and tension. Neighbors began stopping by my cabin, asking questions about Karen and her constant outbursts. It turned out I was not the only one she had been harassing. One man told me she had demanded he move his boat because it did not meet HOA standards, even though his family had been living on the lake decades before the HOA existed. Another woman said Karen had entered her backyard uninvited and tried to measure her fence, claiming it was too high. The stories piled up, and with each one the picture of Karen became clearer to everyone. She was not protecting property values or enforcing any real rules. She was simply hungry for power. I realized the community was starting to see her for what she truly was. Later that evening, while I was stacking firewood, Karen showed up again, but this time she did not storm onto my land. She stood at the edge of my property, arms crossed, staring at me like a predator waiting for a reaction. Her voice carried across the yard as she accused me of poisoning the neighborhood with lies. I told her calmly that people were speaking up on their own and her behavior was finally catching up to her. She laughed sharply and said no one would ever stand against her because fear kept them silent. But as she spoke, two of my neighbors walked up from the trail behind her and stopped to listen. They did not say anything, just stood there with their arms folded, watching her with disapproval. Karen noticed them, and her voice faltered for the first time. She tried to regain her confidence, throwing out accusations about me breaking laws and ignoring rules, but her words fell flat. The neighbors shook their heads, and one of them said everyone knew the truth now, and it was only a matter of time before the sheriff dealt with her once and for all. Karen spun around, glaring at them before storming off down the path, her steps heavy with frustration. I knew then that her grip on the community was slipping. And once people stopped being afraid of her, the walls she had built around herself would begin to crumble faster than she could rebuild them. The following morning, I woke to the sound of voices outside near the dock. When I stepped onto the porch, I saw a small group of neighbors gathered together, talking quietly while pointing in the direction of Karen's house. They looked unsettled, and when they noticed me, they motioned for me to come over. One of them explained that Karen had been out at sunrise shouting about how she was going to report everyone to the county for code violations. She had been walking along the edge of people's yards, scribbling notes in a small book and taking photos with her phone. It seemed she was doubling down instead of backing off. I could see the unease in their faces, but I also noticed something else: determination. The fear she had fed on for years was slowly being replaced by frustration and anger. People were tired of hiding in their own homes. Later that afternoon, Karen came marching up the trail once again, clutching her notebook and a folder of papers. She waved the folder at me, claiming it was proof that my cabin was illegally built on HOA land. I looked her straight in the eye and reminded her once again that I had title deeds and county records to prove otherwise. This time, I invited the gathered neighbors to come and see the documents for themselves. I went inside, brought out the file, and laid it on the picnic table under the shade of a pine tree. Everyone leaned in to look at the official stamps, signatures, and survey maps. Karen hovered over us, her jaw clenched as each person nodded in agreement that the papers were genuine. Her face grew red and her voice cracked as she insisted it was all fake, that I must have forged everything. But the neighbors were no longer listening to her. They turned away from her, muttering among themselves, shaking their heads. Karen stomped her foot and declared that she would have me removed even if she had to call the county herself. Without waiting for a reply, she stormed back down the path, her footsteps echoing in the quiet woods. I could feel the tide turning, and I knew it was only a matter of time before her threats finally backfired completely. That evening the lake was calm, but the air carried a tension that none of us could ignore. Neighbors lingered outside longer than usual, whispering about what Karen might try next. Some admitted they had let her push them around for years simply because they wanted to avoid conflict. But now they saw clearly that her power was nothing more than bluster backed by intimidation. I could feel their support building, and it gave me a sense of quiet strength. The next day, a county truck pulled up the gravel road, and two officials stepped out with clipboards in hand. Karen followed behind them, her face smug, as if she had finally won. She pointed straight at my cabin, declaring it was on HOA land, and demanding they issue me an immediate order to vacate. The officials listened politely, but when I handed them my own documents, their expressions changed. They studied the maps, compared them to their records, and walked the property line carefully with measuring tools. Karen trailed behind them, muttering and gesturing wildly. When the officials finally stopped, they turned to her with firm voices. They explained that the land was mine, legally registered and recorded long before the HOA ever existed. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the rustle of the trees. Karen sputtered that they must be mistaken, that the HOA rules gave her authority over the entire shoreline. But the officials shook their heads, reminding her that no association could override county property rights. The gathered neighbors let out a low murmur of relief, some even smiling for the first time in days. Karen froze, her confidence shattered in front of everyone as the officials wrote notes and reminded her to stay off my property. For the first time, she had been told, no, not just by me, but by the law itself. And I could see in her eyes that she was not used to losing in such a public way. Karen stood stiffly, her arms crossed tight, as the neighbors began whispering louder than before. Some of them chuckled under their breath, while others simply shook their heads as if they had been waiting years for this moment. One neighbor named David stepped forward, his voice steady, as he told Karen that she had made life miserable for too many people. Another woman added that she had been fined by Karen for leaving a canoe tied too close to the dock, even though it was her own dock. More voices joined in, each one retelling moments when Karen had overstepped her authority. Karen tried to wave them off, but her voice cracked as she insisted she was only protecting the beauty of the lake. The officials glanced at each other, clearly realizing they had uncovered a much bigger pattern of trouble. They told Karen plainly that if she continued to trespass or harass property owners, she could face serious legal consequences. Her face drained of color, though she still tried to put on a show of confidence. But the neighbors no longer looked intimidated. They were emboldened, standing together in a way that seemed to surprise even themselves. I quietly watched it unfold, knowing that something had shifted permanently. Karen was no longer the unquestioned ruler of the lake. She was just another neighbor who had finally been exposed for her behavior. The evening sun dipped low, casting golden light across the water as the officials packed up their gear. The neighbors lingered on my property, sharing stories, laughing softly, and even making plans to gather again, without fear of her interference. Karen slipped away down the path, her posture rigid, her silence louder than any words she might have spoken. As Karen walked away, her footsteps crunching on the gravel, the air felt lighter, as if a heavy weight had been lifted. The neighbors slowly turned toward me, their smiles warm and genuine in a way I had not seen before. One of them suggested we celebrate with a simple gathering at the lake, and several others eagerly agreed. I nodded, feeling the first sense of real community since I had moved into the cabin. Soon a few people returned, carrying chairs and small lanterns, while others brought coolers with drinks and snacks. The sound of laughter began to mix with the gentle splash of water against the shore, and for the first time the lake felt like a place of peace instead of conflict. Children ran across the grass, chasing each other with glowing sticks as parents watched them from the circle of chairs. I noticed that many of the neighbors spoke with relief about how long they had dealt with Karen's demands. One man admitted he had thought about selling his property just to escape her constant harassment, but now he felt like things could truly change. Their words made it clear that what happened today was not only about me, it was about all of us reclaiming the freedom to enjoy our own homes. I leaned back in my chair, the fading light reflecting across the water, as the sound of voices grew softer, more comfortable, like the rhythm of waves on the shore. It felt like the beginning of something new, a life by the lake where trust could grow stronger than fear. As the evening deepened, the lanterns cast a soft glow across the circle of neighbors by the lake. The children finally settled down, their laughter fading into the chirping of crickets. I looked out at the still water and felt a quiet sense of belonging wash over me. For so long I had wondered if I had made a mistake buying this property, but now it was clear that I was exactly where I was meant to be. Karen had tried to twist the truth and claim power she never had, but the truth had prevailed. The neighbors no longer whispered in fear of her name. Instead, they spoke freely, with hope and relief. I smiled, knowing that peace had finally returned to the lake and that our community was stronger for having faced her together. The stars sparkled overhead, their reflection dancing on the calm surface of the water as I closed my eyes and let the night embrace me. At last the lake felt like home.